All right, and we are now recording. So this is Rome on Sundays, version 8. It's the 8th edition. Today we have a big little idea called legibility. The author is Venkatesh Rao. He's one of my favorite authors, actually. He runs this blog called Ribbon Farm, and I really like the thinking that they have there. It's not just him writing there, but like a bunch of writers, including Kevin Simler, which is also one of my favorite writers, and he used to be a contributor. Anyways, so this is this paper, or I guess this summary, is of another book called Seeing Like a State, and basically Venkatesh Rao loves this book a lot, and it's one of like one of like the cornerstone books for like the thinking behind his blog. So it's kind of like one of the most popular pieces on the website, and it's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, from that site. And the whole idea behind it is that basically the summary of the book is that societies, specifically the states that run societies, have been molding society by basically taking things that are once illegible, like forests, and trying to make them legible, like what they do with agriculture and scientific forestry and a bunch of different areas of society where they have ledgers now, and they try to make everything in writing, and they try to put everything in numbers. They want to quantify and make everything visible so that they can have greater control over the system. Because once like the whole idea of like you can only change, or you can only control what you measure. So this is the whole idea, is that like you can't really have control over society unless you start measuring things. But the issue that this book comes to, the conclusion that this book comes to, is that there's a huge issue with this idea of making everything legible, is that we live in like complex realities, and we can't, by abstracting and making things legible, we're necessarily cutting off a lot of what makes these realities successful and what people want to live in. We lose a lot of that when we try to make things legible. And the interventions we try to do based on these kind of numbers and metrics and labels that we place on different parts of society, when we try to do that, we end up kind of like, we create this Procrustean bed where we're kind of like doing an unnatural, we're creating an unnatural environment for ourselves. I don't know.
What, percussive bed?
Actually, I wrote down the definition here. So it comes from this, like this is the simple definition, but it comes from this story about how this guy Procrustes, he basically, he had a bed where people would come if they needed to stay at his house. He had a bed, and the thing was, like, if you were too short for the bed, like he would basically cut off your legs and extend them so that they would reach the end of the bed. And then if you were too tall for the bed, then he would cut your legs off so you would fit inside the bed. So the whole idea is, this is what like modernity is doing to us, is that basically they're cutting off, like, or they're kind of manipulating us. Society's manipulating us in ways to conform to things that are unnatural by making us stretch in unnatural ways, or cutting us off in unnatural ways. So like a good example of this is like the school system. Like, because they need to have everything like tests, like they need to mark people, they need to grade people. Like the whole idea of like giving numbers and stuff is so that it's easy for people to like see to create like a hierarchy, so that they can like distinguish who's better and who's worse. But the problem is that who's better and who's worse isn't a quantifiable thing. Like, it's not quantifiable by any way. And like, even and the way that they do it ends up creating like these like crazy bad, like these horrible systems where like everyone's like trying to optimize to this wrong metric of grades, when like everyone knows, like once you like graduate, that like most of what you learn in school, unless you did like a practical degree, is kind of useless, because the way they taught you is useless. They made you just like learn in order to get good marks, because that's the whole Procrustean bed. Like the marks, we stretch ourselves towards to get the marks, and then we cut ourselves off in other ways.
Right. Cool.
All right. Let's go through like some of these notes. So This is kind of like the steps that he lays out, but like what's happening uh, when we apply this kind of idea of legibility. So basically here, like, it's clear that like, even though like most, I guess, governments, like they kind of like have like a good, like they have good intentions, like they want to like make their citizenry prosperous and they want to have everyone doing well. At least that's like if we assume good intentions. Like the problem is that the kind of vision that they have to complete these goals are not really, they're not really based on like anything real. They're based on kind of these fake maps that they've created that they think that will work, but they're based on other maps that are also kind of created. Like they're basically, it's just a whole bunch of, it's like a house of cards. It's a bunch of assumptions based on assumptions. And the issue is the core assumptions are wrong because the core assumptions necessarily have to be legible for us to build on top of them. So when you have something that's like legible, that's like kind of like already a leaky abstraction from like reality, and then you try to build on top of that, you're never going to be able to get like what you want, because like any error you have in like measuring like the differences between each level of abstraction, you end up losing a lot of information, and you end up losing kind of what you wanted to do, and you end up doing something usually like bad. So like usually intervention is really really bad because most people don't know, like there's certain parts in a system that you can intervene and like you can see very clearly it has like a positive or negative reaction. But in most times when you're trying to create change, like in a very very complex system, if you try to like create some kind of complex system on top of it, you're gonna end up with some like really really bad results. So like Holden or Dylan, you guys have any I don't know.
So is the idea that adding complex solutions to these complex societies makes things more complex, and the idea is step away and let the complexities solve themselves?
Basically yes, it's like there's too much, we're trying too hard, we're trying too hard to like come up with solutions that are really complex when like a lot of the times like things can solve themselves. For example, like when you're sick, like if you try to like bombard yourself with like drugs,
Yeah.
like you end up like making yourself more sick. But like
Yeah.
most of the time, you'll end up being fine. There's obviously some cases when you're sick, for example, and it's like it shows all the signs of like being like a common cold that you can normally get out of, but then like it lasts like 2 months, and then you go and then you realize you have like sinus cancer or something. You know what I mean? So like there's obviously the chance that if you let like something go without intervening, that it could get worse. But like the thing is, often the intervention itself can be worse than like the thing it's trying to treat.
And then dependencies form.
Yeah, exactly. And you have too many dependencies. And this is the problem with the like world right now, and why we had this coronavirus pandemic worldwide, is because the world is way too interconnected. Like, there's way too many dependencies. So like if one person's affected, everyone else is affected. And you kind of want to like, in software, they call it like decoupling. And like it's a really big thing where you have to just decouple concerns. Like you want to separate your concerns and decouple dependencies, because you just don't like, the more something is integrated, the more unpredictable outcomes you can have that you can't really predict.
Okay. Cool.
Holden, you have any comments?
I was trying to unmute. I don't know, like it's pretty hard to argue on any of that. Yeah.
Are there any examples of complex systems intervening with complex problems and these systems or these problems get solved? Or is most the examples always negative?
So, for example, one, like the system that South Korea put in place to combat coronavirus was extremely complex. It was like 144 or something steps. And they combated coronavirus way better than almost any other nation. And so like there are definitely examples of like where like you can have but complex solutions to like a complex problem. But arguably in that case, like it might have been like one or two of those 144 measures that really made the difference. So like they could have been like simple measures, but everything else didn't have a negative effect, which is like honestly like very, very like kudos to them that they were able to like whatever solution that they did, like they didn't like do any, like a lot of their solutions, they probably didn't have like second order or third order like negative effects. And we still don't know that because like we still don't know 10 years down the line what happens, or like maybe like the tracking that they, like the tracking and tracing they instituted creates like a new surveillance society in South Korea, which ends up like in 20 years down the line because of like the butterfly effect, you end up getting some like crazy bad outcome. So like you can't really, that's the thing, you can't really predict all those things. So it's always better to do less. It's always better to like prefer less intervention when you can. Like for example, like if you get into a fight with your girlfriend, and then like if you try to intervene afterwards, like things usually get worse. But if you like give it some time, like usually things will like resolve themselves. Because like complex systems, although they can go into chaos, they can also go into equilibrium. So like a lot of times, like a lot of complex systems, they're attracted to certain states. So like even if they go off equilibrium, they can come back to it as long as you leave it alone. But like if you try to do too much, you could like push it into like a different kind of like basically into more chaos. And once you're in that chaos, like you can't really get out of it like easily.
Right.
My thought on that is that I feel like a lot of what our issue is we're not considering, and we kind of said this, but second and third order effects. So when like we try to solve for one problem, we're not thinking how that solution will affect the second and third order effects and can like interfere with those or make things worse. I think if there's a way where we can know every possible effect, then we could properly plan with a solution, but that's just not the case when it gets more and more complex, especially like worldwide.
Like at what point though do you say this problem is bigger than us and we have to let it run its course, or say no, we can fix this and get in there and
so
apply certain measures, science or social issues, and jumping in, and like at what point do you kind of say leave it, or I'm gonna step in, I'm gonna help out, I'm gonna
So I actually don't know the answer to that. There's actually like there's a book, and like this woman Danella Meadows, and her whole like area of research is like where to intervene in systems. So I would need to read that and like kind of synthesize. I tried reading her essay on it once, and it was honestly too complicated for me to understand. Like I was trying to read through it like kind of casually, but it needs like a very deep read.
Yeah.
So like based on what I kind of got from just reading it over was that there are ways in which you can intervene into the system, where there's specific levers that you can turn. For example, like in order, like, you know, like the 80-20 rule, like there's like certain things you can do to get like 80% of the value.
Yeah.
So for example, like with systemic racism, for example, like one of the things like specifically like the biggest problem is like police brutality and like and the justice system being biased against African Americans, and like a lot of it can be solved by like doing things like abolishing police unions, like defunding these like specific things, like the stuff that is like when you find like the root cause of a problem, like if you go deep enough into like a complex system, you can find these like generators, and these generators are like, these are like kind of like the core, which is what's creating all these other feedback loops that like kind of like branch off of it. And like if you can turn off that core one, the other ones slowly start dying off. It's like trying to think of an example.
It's like if you turn the tap down a bit, the trickling slows down and everything else.
Yeah.
It just has to equal out, and then it'll
exactly like that. But like,
it's like it's like a camp. Remember when we dug the holes at the beach in the sand, and then we would do all the
and we would stop and
it was the long rivers we would make and all that shit.
I miss that shit.
Turn it off, it'll still go for a little bit, but eventually it's gonna run into the sand and it's gonna dissipate.
Yeah.
Cool.
And just going back to the notes here, like one big problem I noticed, like he doesn't mention this in the text, but basically like a lot of the problems we have in other, like for example, social science, like anthropology, like psychology, sociology. Like a big issue is that oh, hey Sunny,
Hello.
how's it going?
Good. Sorry, lost track of time.
No problem. We're just talking here about physics envy and how a lot of other subjects they try to apply math and physics and the tools in inappropriate ways because they see all the clean results from like the closed form solutions that you get in physics, like Newtonian physics, like relativity and all that stuff. So we have like a big issue now where we have all these social scientists that they're inappropriately using these tools and leading us to really bad outcomes because they don't realize that you can't apply, for example, Gaussian statistics to fat-tailed processes. Yeah, so I don't know if any of you guys want to chime in on this, if you guys have any examples if you've experienced physics envy in your own line of work. No? I know like maybe like for sales, like or like in any kind of system where you're optimizing for metrics, I think you're kind of missing the point because unless you're dealing with physics or like pure math, when you're optimizing for specific, or even computer science, I guess you could use that as well. But using these techniques ends up like causing us to be misled into thinking that we have confidence in our results when we actually shouldn't have that much confidence in our results because the human reality is not, we're unable to compress human reality into numbers alone. And this really causes problems. And the biggest part of this book that, like the main examples of this book really relate to how states have used this to get control over their populace and create economies and create basically just complex systems of society. But you can kind of use these ideas anywhere and look like, for example, like think about like all like the 12-step plans to get rich or like the 12-step plan to get healthy. Like people think that you can just apply kind of one standard model and apply it to everyone. And like clearly it's not the case. Like everyone is different. And I think this like idea is really potent because if you think about like a lot of the problems we have is because we're not able to fully capture, we're not fully able to compress what we know into symbols that really actually truly represent like what they are. Because like you can like know the name of something and really not know like what it means and like still be using that. And like everyone can even agree on the same definition of the word, but still it's failing to capture the essence of it. Like I forget, there's a word for it. I don't know if any of you remember or know this word, but it's like referring to like things that you can't put into words, but you can only experience. I don't know.
I want to know what that word is, but I don't know what it is.
There is no word for it. It's just the experience.
No, I think.
I'm not sure.
Oh, also, Sunny. So Dylan and Holden, they were campers of Ethan.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, Ethan Buckman.
Oh, yeah.
So Sunny works with Ethan.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Ineffable, Bardia?
Sorry?
Ineffable?
Ineffable. Maybe that's the word.
Yeah.
Maybe it is. So I read the first chapter of this book actually after I read this essay, and it was really cool to see that things like last names were basically made by the state so that they could keep track of people so that they could tax them. And I was like, wow, what the hell?
Interesting.
Yeah. And also, let's see. Okay, yeah. So one thing I really like is comparing like the legible forms that make up most of like high modern and modernist architecture, and then comparing them to things like Gaudi's architecture, which his his work is so illegible that they can't even finish his architecture. So yeah. And like you can just like, I don't know who in their right mind would think that these buildings up top here are more beautiful than these ones, but like I think that's kind of like the essence of like why utilitarianism and trying to like quantify everything and get rid of things that are non-functional, you end up getting these like really, really bland results. So like I'm sure you've been to like university libraries and most of them are in like brutalist style and they're awful.
I like brutalism. I'm guilty.
Really?
Of it. Yeah, like to me, when I see the Bauhaus movement and stuff like that, I enjoy it in the sense of the evenness and the cleanness of it, and I appreciate that. But then you look at Gaudi's work, and it's the total opposite, and it's in its own right just epically awesome. But so, what is the connection here between these bits of architecture to what we were just talking about? Is it the idea, like, so we're talking about these complex systems and stuff like that?
So, like, you know, like Corbusier's like philosophy of how like everything should be functional and modular, and there shouldn't really be any kind of aesthetics or ornaments. Like the aesthetic is kind of like minimalism. So the thing is, like, the things that Le Corbusier designed, like for example, didn't he design that city, right, in India, I think? And no one lived in it because it's like unlivable. And the problem is that like these ideas, the ideas are kind of like, they're utilitarian and they think like, oh, like, why do you have all this ornament? Why do you have like extra space when you don't need it? But the thing is, like, they're thinking very narrowly, and they're not thinking like they also don't have skin in the game because they're not like living in the places that they're designing. So they don't know what the effects are after like 20 years of living, for example, or working, for example, in a brutalist, like in a brutalist building. Like for example, like even like 4 years or 3 years in a university, like being inside brutalist buildings, like I understand the appeal of them.
It bogs down on you. It can be oppressive.
It's very oppressive, and like it feels authoritarian, and like this is like the whole idea.
Food, you have boring sex.
Sorry, Josh.
If you eat boring food, you have boring sex. Sorry, throwing that in there.
Yeah. So. Yeah, basically this whole idea is like people just like they have to think like, oh, like if I can, like, for something to be good, it has to be, you have to be able to kind of put it into words. And like this is kind of the like a really inherent issue with the rational mind of humans, is that we're able to kind of like rationalize everything. And once we have numbers in front of us and once we have things in front of us, it just gives us like that whole like availability heuristic of like, oh, it's in front of us, so it must be true. And like it ends up really screwing with the way we make decisions, because we give weight improperly a lot of times to numbers when we should be kind of thinking about things more holistically, I think.
So in the blockchain space, there's this like term called like crypto economics, which is, I think something that's like improperly used a lot of times, where people like when people are trying to analyze the security of like these decentralized systems, they take a very like purely economic approach, like trying to calculate, okay, this is how much value would be burned or punished if like something goes wrong, and like and they assume like perfectly economically rational attackers and whatnot, which is sometimes I think is sometimes to its detriment, because one thing that a lot of the people who take that sort of mindset don't take into account is that a lot of security and stuff can come from other sources, such as political or social desire to keep a system if the stakeholders in a system are driven by incentives other than purely economical, that actually can add like a higher barrier to attack than the purely economical.
Oh yeah, 1,000%. I think that was like I studied crypto economics a bit when I was learning some stuff about the blockchain, and yeah, like I thought that like the fact that we base like all our models kind of on these like just pure economics game theory, I think it's really misguided. And I think like, I think it's really smart. Like, I remember what you guys did with like the game of stakes, having these kind of like just kind of testing things out in like a real world simulation. It's like so much more important to getting real world testing than it is to just think about like purely economically what would happen in a simulation just computationally.
Mhm.
And I think I think something specifically with crypto, I think people don't really let's see.
Damn dog.
My dog is crazy.
Where's Bahadur? Is Barney? Are you at home right now?
Yeah, my brother is actually where is he right now? I think he's either he's in his room or he went to go see his friend.
Fair enough.
One really interesting thing, moving away from what we were just talking about, was this this paper. I don't think it was. I think Venkatesh, like the author, not the book author, brought this up, but he brought up some study from another book where they found that human brains, like when we're shown patterns that are just white noise, we end up panicking. We actually go into fear. And this like kind of like, I think Jordan Peterson always talks about it, and he says like your mind is at ease when you think everything is in order. Like, for example, like if you're sitting in a class and like someone asks a question, everything's kind of in order. But if someone starts like yelling like random noises, like starts yelling loud noises, and just starts jumping around like the room, you're going to start panicking because like you're in complete chaos because your brain can't compress. It can't understand what's going on. It can't make it legible because like, how can your brain explain what's going on here, right? So that's why we even have like names for like diseases and disorders, because like not knowing what something is makes it that much scarier. Like that's why we're scared of things in the dark, because like we can't see it. And this is the whole idea of legibility. Like this, and this is Venkatesh's theory that our drive for legibility is like out of fear of chaos, because the more we make things in order, the more we think we have them in control. So the less we're scared of like unintended or like unknowns. And the issue is that we create way more unknowns, and we create a false sense of certainty by making things legible and like abstracting things with leaks. And like we end up getting this issue where we're like out of fear, we're creating things that we should be afraid of.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think it's like, I think it's true. And like, I think this is what we face. Like when you have cognitive dissonance, like, I think it's like when your mind is telling you like you can't compress something. So like, you're starting to get a little afraid of it. Like you start avoiding thinking about the cognitive dissonance because it means that your mind has failed to like make something in order. So it's chaotic. And yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea. And like when we talked about Dylan and Sunny, you weren't here. We had another room on Sundays about driven by compression progress. And I think this essay ties in really well with like the main core thesis of that paper, which was about how everything that we find interesting, beauty, art, all of that can be just explained by our intelligence being rewarded by the intrinsic ability to compress things and create internal symbols for things. So the reason why we find faces, for example, more attractive if they look more like ours is because our model face in our brains is based more on us, because we've seen our face so many times that when we see someone who looks like us, it takes less information to encode that face. So we find it, because we can compress it more, we find it more attractive. So it's a really, really interesting theory.
That's cool.
I don't know. Like, there's also benefits to this compression. Like, we're talking about all the bad things, but like, for example, like we wouldn't be able to have like a lot of the scientific, like kind of global science if we weren't able to have like the metric system, for example. And a lot of the things that we take for granted, for example, like time zones and like like any kind of unit of measurement. Like all these things are from our drive to compress and make things legible. So like there are definitely benefits, and like you can't really like say that it's all bad. And the thing is, we just have to like try to like make sure that we cut off like ways in which it can hurt us. Like for example, like daylight savings time is like something that like at one point it was probably a great idea, but over time people have seen that like the effects of it aren't that good, and they cost millions of dollars. So maybe if we could revert back to a system without it, but like we don't really know.
How does it cost millions?
I actually don't know why and how it costs millions, but
The amount of people that miss work the next day when they forget to set their clocks back.
There's also like entire
Anyway.
software consulting companies that like specialize in helping like other software companies deal with like daylight savings, time zone stuff, leap seconds, all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, leap seconds is pretty crazy.
What's leap seconds?
Like computers don't like a lot of languages don't have the ability to like process leap seconds natively. So like a lot of web systems or like a lot of things, anything that has to do with time is actually really, really hard to deal with in computers because
I think he was asking what is a leap second.
Sorry?
I think he was asking what a leap second is.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like,
So a leap second is basically like, you know, like how, so you know how we have all this, like the Gregorian calendar has all this stuff that like, wait, actually, let's do the calendar. Actually, with the day. So, you know, we say it's like, okay, Earth rotates in 24 hours. But the thing is, it's actually not exactly, it's off by a little bit. And so what scientists do is sometimes they add a second here and or remove a second. I don't think they ever remove it. They add a second here and there just to even it out to make the Earth's rotate. Because Earth's rotation isn't perfectly constant, right? And so if when they detect that, oh, it's like off by what our timekeeping systems say, then they'll add a second randomly just to resync those a little bit. And so you'll have two. So what you'll have is I think it happens always at like 3 a.m. or something. So it'll go from 3:59, 59 seconds to 3:59, 60 seconds, then to 4 a.m. So it'll have like a weird extra second there. And like this like crashes like, you know, daylight savings and stuff and time zones is like a frequent enough event that like a lot of software like is forced to deal with it. But these leap seconds, so much software is not meant to deal with it. It crashes like stock exchanges and stuff all the time, and it's a whole mess.
Okay. Leap seconds.
Yeah, anything dealing with like real world like state, trying to like model it in computers is really, really difficult.
It's not even just modeling it in computers. It was in like modeling it in our like human kept time is like where the discrepancy comes, right?
Yeah, and like because like sorry,
complex on the complex systems.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to go back to that thing you said about like the beauty and stuff. Like I didn't quite fully understand. So is the claim here that like beauty is this like psychological thing that incentivizes us to try to intake information like that requires less computation?
Basically, yes. Basically, that's the argument. So it's basically he's using this idea of beauty as it's actually the derivative of interestingness. So it's like how interesting something is at like a certain point. So it's like the acceleration of interestingness for us. Because like you can like, or actually maybe was it the other?
Yeah, wait,
oh no, the other way, sorry. Interestingness is like the derivative of beauty. So something can be beautiful, but how interesting we find it is how much we can compress at a given, I guess, observation. Because like, for example, like you can find like, if you've seen the same face like 100 times, it can still remain beautiful, but it's less interesting because you've seen it so many times, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, yeah, beauty might be what, like, I don't 100% know, like this is a very elegant theory, but like, I don't think, again, like this is another case where like, it's probably too elegant and it probably doesn't map one-to-one with what's true, right?
Right.
So, but it's an interesting framework to view beauty. I think it's one of the more the bigger stretches that this guy takes. I think it's or like, for example, he brings this up in the paper about how like we view like Newton's equations and Einstein's equations like as beautiful and like elegant, and we see elegance in proofs, we see elegance in like clean code. So like we see things like, and like those are compressed, those are like very, very compressed things. The more you compress something, the more beautiful it gets, kind of. So it's interesting.
So, but then go back to the architecture thing, right? The Gaudi work. In what way is that a high level of compression?
So he actually writes in this driven for compression thing that let me go back to it. He's talking about how when you see, so for example, like I think he actually even brings up Gaudi in his talk about the paper, but how like it gives you new ways of compressing things that maybe your brain didn't think of before. So he brings this kind of to the idea of art, of music, and how we like music that's like kind of familiar, but also brings like interesting new patterns that we didn't know could be compressed in this way before. So like I think you're right. There is a bit of a stretch, and it becomes like more like it's harder to justify the thesis when it comes to like looking at things like beauty.
But then it can also be stretched where,
Well, you can go beauty versus efficiency pretty easily in regards to food. Like, you do not need to eat fancy food or anything. You could live on Soylent. But who wants to do that? How boring and bland would that be to not experience the rest?
yeah, like it depends like how complex someone can take something in. You know, like someone, like, is there ties to people who find Gaudi's architecture, who find it extremely, extremely beautiful, have, say, a higher level of IQ or able to take in more information, opposed to someone who is not lesser or slower, but someone who maybe can't understand it, doesn't appreciate it as much, but then they'll appreciate a Bauhaus more because it's simple and it's just there, it's equal, and it follows proportions and it's all ratioed out. Whereas Gaudi just
here he talks about it here where I highlighted, and basically you're exactly right. And the thing is, like, for example, there's like this type of music that he talks about, and I forget exactly what it's called. I think it's 12-tone music, and it's this very, very kind of jarring music because
it's like 24 notes.
No, what it tries to do is instead of having like a melody where it stays mostly in one key, there's no key. So basically all the notes are played evenly throughout the whole piece. So it sounds really weird, but what this paper argued and what you were saying kind of supports this, like this whole idea of those who are like, they understand this music, those who have studied it, appreciate it so much more, and they find it much more beautiful than someone who's never heard of it. And I noticed it myself when I first listened to it without knowing anything about it. And then after 20 minutes of researching what the music was and what 12-tone music is, listening to the same piece, I liked it more.
Yeah. I think it's, I said people who lesser IQ, and I take that back. More someone who's less educated.
Less educated about that.
Less educated is what I should have said.
Yeah.
Someone who doesn't understand the process that went into that.
Exactly. The same way, like, how would you find Einstein's equation beautiful unless like you know the physics behind them, right?
Everything behind that, yeah.
That's why it's beautiful, because it compresses down all that hard information that like you learn, like all this hard stuff, and you're like, wow, like,
yeah,
they did it. And like I notice it all the time, like Littman, like he always like he finds like such like more pleasure in songs that like he could tell like what the artist was thinking like when he was doing it, because like he knows like the chord progression, like all that kind of stuff. Like when you know music, like music just becomes better.
I was watching a video of this classical jazz pianist having a conversation with Herbie Hancock, and the way they had the conversation was, it was basically he would go to Herbie and he would say, have you ever had the feeling where you want to be like this? And he'll do a chord progression, and then he'd be like, but then sometimes you just go like this, and he goes and does another chord progression, and then Herbie's like, yeah, I know that feeling exactly. And you sit there and you're like, these guys are having a conversation within another conversation with another language of music. And I
Yeah.
don't get it, but it's just nuts.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
That's cool.
Yeah. Let's go back to the notes actually. So yeah, so like that's why like yeah, I feel like if you studied these in school, like I did like a paper for Jason Ahrensberg actually on Le Corbusier, and that's why I know anything about Le Corbusier. And yeah, I guess like I kind of like when I was studying it, I enjoyed like looking at his like architecture and designs more because I knew more about it. But then once I got kind of like or like I guess like maybe like brainwashed by Nassim Taleb, and I've become like kind of like anti anything modern. And I'm just like about things that kind of like last a long time. So like these buildings will never last a long time, but like the Sagrada Familia, like in Gaudi's architecture, like that will always be beautiful. But like it's like the difference between trendy and stylish. Like you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
but look at the simplicity of the Bauhaus compared to the simplicity of the pyramids. You know, that is literally the simplest form possible, and that thing is still there. I'm not saying that
Yeah, fair.
I'm not saying that building will be there forever. I
Yeah.
think the only reason it would be there forever now is because it's historical. But if it didn't have that historical relevance, it would get knocked down.
I think the issue is that modernist architecture necessarily employs modernist techniques that do not last a long time. So like the materials and like the building techniques that they use to actually build modernist stuff won't last nearly as long as like, for example, the pyramids were built with like ancient techniques. Like they last a long time. And like, there's like certain like, for example, churches, like in any city, like churches are usually the most beautiful buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Usually they're the oldest ones too. So
yeah, but are those not getting touched because it's more than just a building? It's a place of worship, and there's
for sure.
That's hard to say because there's government intervention in regards to any of that kind of stuff. Like if anything's considered a heritage building, they legally aren't allowed to alter it. They need to hire a specialist to go in brick by brick to make any renovation or any change. So who knows if it would be kept because people like it or because we're kind of forced to because it has historical value.
Right.
Yeah, like I don't know, like I find it interesting because like your art would be considered, I don't know, like what would you consider your art, Dylan? Like postmodernist?
No, it would be more what's the word?
Millennial.
No. What is it's not postmodern. It's like tied to that. It's past that postmodern. Whatever art is made.
Postmodern.
Like, give me a second. Let me look it up. Oh, contemporary.
Contemporary, yeah.
Contemporary. Anything that's made now is contemporary art, in my opinion. How do I get back to this?
And what do you guys think in terms of like the future? Because like I think we're like moving towards like a even more legible society, and like we're kind of like leaning into legibility, and like everything's being put into code and codified and like made into rules and laws and everything. And especially with the blockchain, like everything's going to be kind of there and legible on the ledger.
I think it's interesting.
It's interesting, and also it really like aligns with our now like how much onus we put on accessibility in regards to like the physicality even of things, having elevators or even accessible to people who can't walk or hearing impaired, etc. Like even as much as we're doing it on the computer side, it's also happening very physically in our world now and how we do construction and build. It's just another consideration.
Yeah, like I recently I've been thinking a lot about the production process. Like if you think about how the world was able to change when the printing press came around, we were able to duplicate so many of the exact same thing and you could get all that information out. But now there's new technologies with generative design. What if we could go into a world where every single product is made individually for one person, and you can do that and it doesn't stop the production. You can put into these programs and say through 3D printing, say, give me all the iterations of this shape, but it's going to always cost me $5 to print. How many things can I make out of that? And it still follows the line of production, but it takes out it takes out that it's always going to be the exact same. So you can always have this unique individual object while being a part of a greater ecosystem, if that makes sense. It's all tied.
I love that idea.
Yeah, that's like when I look at like the gaudy stuff, it's like, man, if he was around today, the shit that he would be doing is just nuts. But
I think he would be making like virtual reality worlds, to be honest. I think like he'd be making some crazy, or like I think the people like him are in video game design right now, you know, like they're building those crazy worlds that like, or like the people who do it for fun. Like, have you seen those like Grand Theft Auto and like Skyrim mods?
No.
Oh my God. People design the most ridiculous, like way better graphics than like the original game. Like they just like create all these models, these characters, these game modes, and they just like put it on top of the game. And I just like think like these people are just geniuses. Like, and like they put so much, sorry?
I've seen that for like Ocarina of Time. Like they're like remaking like N64 games and making it look like it's the best graphics like to date. And it's like recreate the whole game. It's crazy.
It's all the same skeleton. They're just putting the new graphic on top.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
No. All right. Let's see what is the end of this. Okay, so then he's just asking. Basically, the question is like, is this model, this failure mode of legibility, is it still relevant today? And I think we all agree that it's extremely relevant, and it's only becoming more so relevant. And I think one thing he talks about, Venkatesh, in this paper is this idea of like choice architecture, and how a lot of like the liberal governments are trying to push for this kind of idea of like nudging people towards making decisions that they believe is correct for them. And the issue here is that like decisions don't scale up. So like if everyone makes the locally optimal decision, you don't necessarily get the globally optimal conditions. And I think this is like a huge issue where, like, for example, like, actually, I don't know if this is the right example, but something about coronavirus, and like maybe the locally optimal decision for you is to not wear a mask or like go outside and do whatever you want. But like the globally optimal decision, if everyone did that, would be chaos and everyone's dying. You know? So yeah. And like this, and I think this all comes down for like this paternalistic kind of notion of the government that like we know what's best for you. And I think this is like kind of like a big plague of modern society, is that more and more like left-leaning individuals and organizations are putting their trust in like governments that think that, like, they think they know what's best for them, but they don't actually. And like, I'm not a conservative by any means. Maybe like in some ways I'm become more conservative, but I'm definitely don't align myself with like conservative like party. But like anytime I think about like the liberals or like Democrats and just like expanding the reach of the government, I just think of like the more things that they can just control and like intervene in this high modernist way. And I just think like this, like it's better if there's less government and there's a little bit more kind of free hand of the market. In some ways, no, because you get things like, I don't know, even just like there's tons of issues where the government doesn't intervene where they should, especially in the US. In Canada, we're shielded because our government intervenes a lot. But I don't know, like, what do you guys think? Like, do you think we should have like more like libertarian governments, like hands off, or like more local governments maybe?
I think it's dependent on the size of the population.
I think it's also dependent on how you do it. Like, you can't just stop it and then let shit happen.
In principle, I think libertarian, there's a lot of merit, but I think there has to be a lot, like we have to prepare our society for 10 years prior. You can never switch just like through one election. I feel like you need to educate people to such a higher level if you wanted to run a society that way, where there were those freedoms and there was more actual choice, let's just say. I mean, right now, I don't think we're just responsible enough to do that.
So it would be something like, okay, in the next 10 years, we're going to start taking out the 12th, 11th, and 10th grade, and at those moments in time, figure shit out.
I think like if we move to like an apprenticeship model, you could do that. Like,
Yeah.
you could get rid of those grades. But like,
it's so much more beneficial.
yeah, if you put everyone in jobs, like, it would be much better. Society would be much better off with rather than like a bunch of university graduates.
Yeah.
And Sonny, I was
Yeah,
wondering. Sorry.
I just think it'd be so cool to have an education system where your 12th grade is like you spend 8 months working at 8 different industries that you've chosen at the beginning of the year. So you get a taste of everything.
That would be
There'd be
thing.
so
Then
much
you
more
can-
value.
Then
you
you
could
know
choose
exactly
university,
what you don't like.
right?
Yeah, man.
So
But the thing is like sometimes 1 month isn't enough to see if you don't like something.
sure, but it would give you a better idea than whatever you currently have.
Oh, for
Yeah.
sure, 100%, 100%.
Yeah, 1 month is better than going and studying a subject for 4 years, 5 years, getting a job in it, and then sitting down and be like, "Oh fuck, this was not."
Never
this was
mind
not
that.
the right choice."
You've already like dedicated so much when you've started university. You've paid for it. You've committed that time to it. And then do you want to quit and switch and pay again and you lose that time again? It's such a trap.
Well, there's a huge stigma of quitting and starting again. Like, I went through it through university. I was like, I was 2 years into a program. Like, I don't like this, but I'm 2 years in. I only got 2 more years to go. Like, I'll just finish it. I finished it, and I'm like, fuck, I should have just gone back and did what I liked and did what I wanted to do. But there's a huge stigma of this. I'm quitting and I'm restarting. It's like, that should be celebrated of, yeah, stop. You don't like it? Stop. Go do something that you like, figure that out. Don't feel forced into this one pigeonhole you've put yourself in.
Yeah. Well,
I
on
think
top of that,
twice.
you still need the luxury of choice to be able to even afford to do that in the first place.
True.
I think one thing I read also on this Ribbon Farm blog, it's a blog chain, so it's actually like a chain of blog posts. It's this chain of blog posts called Predictable Identities, and it's based on this other theory of the mind, which is that our mind basically works by trying to like actively predict things and then update our predictions as we're observing things, like kind of like Bayesian statistical updating, but with our brains and prediction. And basically this whole thing, the reason why I think if you accept this theory is true, why people don't like, or like there's a stigma around, for example, quitting and restarting, is that people don't like to like think. They don't like to think, so they don't want, like, if they can't predict your actions, for example, if you start something and quit and then restart or do something else, that means they can't predict you. And people don't like unpredictable people. People like consistent, predictable people. So like if you can't fit in within a certain like kind of archetype that they've like thought about you, then it bothers them because their brain isn't able to, again, like compress you down to like what they like, something neat in their head that they can just compress. But the thing is, like, you can never compress someone down like that. So like you need these archetypes. And the thing is, like, for example, like once you like reach a certain level of like unpredictability, people just categorize you as weird and like off mainstream. And then everything you say has a certain air of like incredulity, because like no one believes what you say, because like they think you're just like, oh, he's just another weirdo. So in this blockchain, this guy Jacob Falkovich, he talks about how like you have a sort of weirdness budget. So you have like a certain amount of things that you can have like off kilter views about, and people will still believe you. But if you go too far off the edge, then people will not believe anything you say because they'll just think you're crazy.
Now I can actually speak to that very directly. I can get away with doing a lot more fucked up shit than most other people. for whatever reason, I can go and say more ridiculous things and do weirder things and it be more accepted than somebody else. Now, if that's just based on charisma, looks, or social acceptance around your peers who expect you to do that and other people react based on their initial reaction, but it's just really interesting how
Yeah.
I see somebody else do something I would do, they get completely shit on for it, I can do it, and everyone thinks it's amazing.
Yeah.
So it's
It's
very
like
interesting.
it's like you need to be relatable somehow to people. So like for example, like if I have like all these weird ideas about kind of like how things work, like non-mainstream ways of thinking, but if I'm also liking really weird music and not like liking mainstream things, not watching mainstream shows, everyone will think I'm crazy. But like if for example, like I watch the NBA, I watch Game of Thrones, like I listen to rap music, like when you engage in enough like mainstream things, people will like are able to relate to you, so they'll be able to trust you more. And like this is like a huge thing, is like people don't trust people who are like not like them. And I think it's something like it's just like inherently human, because like we're just like drawn to those who look like us, and like we're scared of those who don't look like us. So like
Yeah, but then there's the weird culture where people look at you who are like, oh, that guy's so weird. He watches all these normal things and doesn't listen
of
to.
course it's subjective. It's super subjective. It's like it's the same way. Like for example, we probably all look at people like who just like they're just like you call them basic, like just like like you look at someone and they just follow like the norms and they don't do anything out of the norm, and then the people outside the norm look at them toward like they have a stigma around them too.
Yeah.
And it's because they're too predictable. It's like, oh, like if you tell like if you like there's certain guys I know that like you tell me like one thing they like, I can tell you like 10 other things that they're like engaging with. Like
Yeah. Yeah. You gotta break through to the weird side.
Yeah. But it's the same even in these like weird even in like the sub niche cultures, it is the same. Like when I go on Twitter, like almost everyone, like I'll meet like a random person who's like involved in software some way, and like we've read the same things, like we've read the same blog posts, we listen to the same, we follow the same Twitter, listen to the same podcast, like it's like it ends up becoming like an echo chamber somewhere somehow, like even in the most niche places.
Yeah,
you end up becoming like a normie at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I like, and honestly, like it's like that whole thing of like like when you feel cool, you're like, oh, like I found like this new artist, like I feel so cool. Or like, oh, I found like this new book, I feel so cool. And then it's like, oh, everyone's already read it, and you're like, fuck, like now it's not cool. Even though I still like love it, like it's not as cool anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, I realize we are about an hour in now.
Is that the time limit? Is it an hour?
Like we can go longer if you want. Like I usually just set it as like we usually finish.
I've got
around
nothing
an hour.
better to do. I'm just driving. So
yeah, if you guys, if anyone,
I've never been involved. I don't know what the protocol is.
Well, we can keep talking. I don't know what else you guys want to talk about.
Earlier, you mentioned this thing about the nudging state. Can you explain to me a bit more about this? Like, I never quite understood why people are so against like nudging. For me, when I read like Sunstein's stuff, I thought this was like, oh wow, this is like a reasonable middle ground between libertarian, like more hands off versus hands on.
The way that I think about it is that like if you can nudge someone in like a direction that like you can control, it's the same as being able to control them. So like if you lay out, for example, a map for someone to go in, and if all the ways that they can traverse the map always lead to the same 3 spots, do they really have free will?
I mean, I think the point of nudging is not to close off any...
Sorry, what's the context of nudging? Like...
Yeah, nudging is just... So it's this concept in like behavioral science where the concept is when you apply it to political economy, it's essentially the idea is the government should be able to sort of not restrict people's freedoms, but be able to nudge them towards the right direction. So an example, for this would be that when you go into a grocery store, put the healthier foods further up front and the unhealthy foods further in the back, so they're harder to get to. Like that would be an example of a nudging technique in order to like guide people towards making better decisions while not actually restricting any freedoms in general. Or the
Makes
human
sense.
product.
Makes
Yeah.
sense.
Is nudging frowned upon? Do people see that and say,
I
"Oh,
mean, it
fuck,
could be
I'm
used for, clearly could be used in either way, right? You could be nudged to think that Trump's an incredible leader, or you could be nudged to think that
Well-
Hillary was an incredible leader.
Well, the
I
thing
guess,
is, the way that I look at it is, for example, like with the healthy like foods, like nudging, for example, like in theory, it's a great idea. Like I love that idea that like it's so easy. You can just put the healthier foods in front. Everyone like they're more likely to eat them than making that extra effort for the unhealthy foods. But the problem is like who defines what is healthy, and like who's the person paying for that kind of that initiative for the government. And the problem is that like usually it's like these big huge lobby groups that are supporting big industry, and like I just have a very like yeah, anytime the government can like guide me towards a better decision, like I'm worried because the person influencing the government to do that is usually not the right person.
The issue is that there always will be someone, deciding the layout of the grocery store.
Of course.
So I'd rather have that someone be the government, a government that is accountable to the people. And so I feel like, yes, there is this question, there is this question of, how do we make sure that we do know what's healthy or not? Like, there's like 50 different versions of like all these ideologies of like what's healthy or not,
Exactly.
Some people are like, oh, you need to eat an all fat diet. That's what, that's healthy. While other people are no meat whatsoever. But like, I feel the problem of trying to solve what is the right or the best policy to nudge people towards is sort of, it's at least a better, more constrained problem than like, having an authoritarian system where, that's still, you still have to decide those things, but now you don't have a choice. But I'd rather have a nudging system than an authoritarian system.
For sure.
And I'd probably also have a nudging system that's publicly accountable than a purely like chaotic like libertarian system in which basically the centers of power are illegible, where you don't see where they are.
Yeah. 100%. I think the thing is like, for example, like when you're nudging someone towards like a good decision, I think it's harder to nail down what a good decision is, but I think it's more fruitful if we look at nudging people away from bad decisions. For example, maybe not thinking about what food's healthier to put in front, but maybe making sure that the packaging for unhealthy foods is really unappealing. And because we know very clearly what's unhealthy, but we don't know clearly what is healthy. So I think like the nudging has to be
cigarettes are a perfect example of the government trying to do that.
Exactly. They're trying to do that. And I think it probably works, and it's super expensive. Like they should be doing that with sugar, but like they don't do that with sugar, or like at least like white refined sugar and stuff like that. But like, because obviously not all sugar is bad.
Also, it's like the idea of like what carbon tax is trying to.
What they're trying to. In theory. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that like they don't really understand the second and third order consequences of making. It's like people aren't driving less. Like if there was an alternative, if there was more Teslas around, then like yeah, the carbon tax makes sense. But like when you don't have that easy alternative to go towards, so yeah, maybe you do need the government to nudge you towards the Tesla purchase with gas rebate, electric car rebates.
I drove a Tesla today. It's orgasmic. It's insane.
Also, the other issue is
Sorry?
Go ahead, buddy. I'll speak after.
I literally was just gonna ask, like, tell me more about the Tesla experience. I've never been.
It's mind blowing. It's just like I've sat in it before, but then driving it is just like it's just a completely weird feeling. It's like when you try and go around someone in a car, it's not like you need room to go around them practically. It's just you're already going the speed you need to be to pass them.
True. So you don't like feel the
and there's no noise. No, you feel the acceleration.
Oh, you feel
it. Feels fucking great. But like the second you take your foot off the gas pedal, it already starts like braking. It's not like a car where it's like it'll slowly torque down.
Wow.
It'll stop when you take your foot off the gas pedal.
Very interesting. I need to drive one.
Yeah, it's so cool. And the features, man, there's like, you can, like, it's built in to have like whoopee cushions in the car. So like you can make it sound like people fart when they sit down.
Yeah.
Like, that's so fun.
I can't believe they put that in there.
They put that in the space shuttle.
No
So
way.
as they were flying up, they had a live view, and there was reporters talking about them going up, and they started clicking the fart button as they were going up. It's just,
Incredible.
it's great.
Oh, like let's also talk about maybe like, for example, like living in like suburbia. I don't know. Are all of us living in suburbia right now?
At the moment.
I wouldn't even call where we live suburbia.
What? Why?
Now,
What
how
do you
would you
mean?
define suburbia?
I think of suburbia as like, have you seen Weeds?
No.
No.
The TV show Weeds?
Well,
No.
you live closer to like you're in Midtown. You're less suburban than like me and Holden.
Yeah, I guess so.
And like Dylan, whereabouts do you live?
I'm at like DuPont and Christie.
Oh, so you're like closer to downtown.
Yeah. So suburbia, just like suburban living, like living
Yeah.
Thornhill or
It's like
Are you guys all from Toronto?
Yeah.
Toronto area?
Yeah.
Where are you from, Sonny?
I live at the moment. I'm actually at my parents' house in New Jersey, so I'm actually like in very much suburbs right now. But normally I live in New York.
Like Manhattan or Brooklyn?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Manhattan.
Nice. Do you guys have an office there, Cosmos?
We have a small WeWork. There's like 2 other people there. So yeah. I used to live in SF. We have much more people there, but I got fed up with SF, so I moved out to New York.
Why'd you get fed up with San Francisco?
I don't know. I lived in the Bay Area for like 4 years already. Just so expensive. I feel it's like the same price as New York, but it's just like, you don't get as much in San Francisco. If I'm paying those prices, I'd rather be somewhere where I'm getting more bang for my buck.
Yeah, I feel like the lived experience in New York. Like I haven't been to San Francisco, but I just love New York.
Yeah.
And like it's in Manhattan's like it's a magical place.
Yep.
Yeah. It's like there's nowhere else really like it.
Mm-hmm.
never been.
Oh, it's you definitely have to go once this coronavirus is done.
Get there with things there. Yeah. Why were you asking about the suburbia?
Because suburbia is like it's like a planned neighborhood, and like this is kind of this whole idea of like legibility, and like they made these kind of like grids, and it's funny because Manhattan is like all grids, but it still has a great like experience, like lived experience, because it was really grown bottom up, and like actually I don't know because I haven't read, like, have you guys heard of the book like The Power Broker by Robert Caro?
Yeah.
It's like about how like Sorry?
Oh, I just sorry. I haven't read it. I've read a lot about it.
I don't know much about it. I just know that this guy basically like made most of New York, or set up the infrastructure for it. So maybe it was high modernist ideals. I don't know. But yeah, like I don't know. I find like suburban living so boring, and like you can't like it feels just not natural to live in like a suburban world,
I mean, I guess it depends. Like, do you think living in a tight knit city normal when there's a whole world out there?
Is living in a 40-story high rise normal? Like, what's
like
normal?
I don't think that's normal either.
I guess it depends what your normal is. Like, some people will be like, yeah, I love living in the city. I love being in all the hustle and bustle. Some people are like, I would rather be on a farmland and have no one around me, and I'm just in nature. Some people live in the freaking woods. You're like, yeah, I like being in nature,
Yeah, I agree, but I think those are two very different than suburbia, because you don't get either of those.
Yeah, it's like a weird middle.
It's a weird middle where you have to drive everywhere, and I think that's the problem. Is that like the way they designed, like they basically created suburbs like around the road. They designed everything around having roads and like driving places, and like if you want to do anything when you can't drive, or like if you want to just walk around somewhere, it's not it's not designed for that. So like you end up cutting out this whole kind of like, that's like Toronto just like I find has a very bad or very outside downtown has a very poor lived experience because like it's mostly suburbs.
Yeah.
And like my area I think is like, I'm lucky, like there's tons of parks around here, and this is one of the weird planned communities in North America where they design the streets not in a grid, and it's like it seems like it's like natural. If you look at it from above, it like looks kind of like I don't know, like
because they weren't trying to maximize that area for space or for space. They're maximizing it for money they can charge per square foot with really big houses.
Oh well, I don't know about. I think they were just they planned Don Mills like this area to be kind of like look and feel like a lived neighborhood and not like a grid. So they specifically made our area like it's the only little block like Leslie and Lawrence area that's actually like that. If you go anywhere else in the city, it's not. But yeah, like even with the plan, like even though they try to make it look like not like a grid, there's still issues where all the houses look the same and it feels like you're like that's like the worst part. Like if you've been to like suburbs where they just recently built everything, you just see like rows of houses and they're all the exact same. And it's like, imagine just like walking like every day there, like you would just go crazy. It's like being in kind of like a dungeon where everything's just like you're walking past the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, but then, like, I agree. Like, I don't love that look of all being the exact same. But then I kind of think about the like you think about the benefits of like a school uniform. You know, I don't have to think about it. This is my school uniform. Is what it is. You know, with a home, this is just a place over my head. This is how much I got to pay for it. That's it. I don't have to worry about anything. This is just a place. You know? I don't know where I was going with that.
I get what you mean. Like if you think about it like from that perspective, but I also think like it's really important where you live because it's like kind of like your environment, right?
Yeah.
And like it's like it affects like the way you think, the way you like everything. Like I remember when I was like living in like it was a pretty big apartment, but I was in like London on like Ontario, like when I was at Western. And living in like the apartment buildings where every single unit looked exactly the same, and just like it brings you down. Like it's so depressing. Like, but then like when I was in Lisbon and like living in like a small place, but it just like it felt quaint, like cozy, and like you walk around and everything's different. You see like new things every day, and you're just like yeah, like I don't know. I think
people want to be able to express themselves.
Yeah, and I think
if you're living in these cookie cutter places, it's harder to get that expression out.
Yeah, and I think that's like the issue with everything in this modern, not everything, but the vast majority of things in modernity is like it's cookie cutter because everything's industrial, everything's made in a factory, everything's made like one of 1 million.
Yeah,
and like I really like. One of the great things about like I think the information age is that it's re-decentralizing things and getting the things back to being local, and like you can get local things much easier. Like you can buy things from local artisans without having to like go physically to their store. Like you can go online, or like you can use 3D printing to like make things for you yourself custom. And like soon enough, like more and more things will be able to be like made next to your house rather than like having to buy it from like so we do have hope. We do have hope that things will go back to like more custom. And like for example, like Rome research is actually like one of the most, I would say, like least modern, high modern authoritarian approaches to software, because it just allows you from the bottom up to like create anything you want, make it like any kind of note system, any kind of space repetition system. You can create like to-do list, Kanban boards. You can really like create anything, because like they basically just gave you like Legos to work with. But then like other software just like kind of imposes on you like this is how note-taking should be done, so you have to do it according to the way like we made the system. And it's like, no, like here you go, here are all the tools, like build yourself a note-taking system that suits you.
Right.
And I think like that's what we should be doing with like education. Like here are all the tools, like here are the best learning resources, and like you can choose your own path. But like we've curated all the best resources for you.
Yeah.
So like you don't have to like look too hard. Like it's accessible for you to choose your own path. I think that's the thing. It's like it's so much easier for us to choose like the cookie cutter path in every direction. It's always easier because it's like cheaper, faster.
Yeah.
And yeah, like let's just like end off here. This was an interesting point that Venkatesh said when he was reading this book, that it reminded him of the great decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and that the Romans had this very big desire to make everything legible, and this was part of their downfall. And he sees the same, like he sees that like the same thing is happening in the US, and I agree 100%. And like the US is probably the most like like everything is about universality. Like that's like one of their like core things. Like everyone is equal in front of the law, you know? Like they go by this whole kind of dictum that like we know what's best for you, and what's best for you is best for everyone. And yeah, so I'm highly concerned about the US, especially like after the events of the last like couple months. It's been really, really scary. All right.
It's scary, but I think it's shit. It's coming up. It needs to come up, and
Yeah,
will get solved. And
things need to be solved, or else they're gonna collapse really, really badly.
Yeah.
All right, guys, this was fun. Hope to see you guys all again next week. Thank you for coming, newcomers Dylan and Sunny. It's great to have you.
It's just fun.
And
I'll do my readings. I'll do the readings next time. Is that usually the protocol? Read it all and then jump in?
You don't need to read anything if you don't want to.
You just read a bit of the notes.
Just if you read these learnings, I usually make a condensed like 1 page or less than a page thing. Just every week, those ones are like probably just like all you need to like kind of get the gist of it. And then if you want to go more in depth, these are like notes I make. And then the bottom here, like I copy and paste like most of the article, whatever like relevant bits, and then highlight them. So
yeah, just give me little things on the top. Just give me that nudge, nudge me.
Yeah. Well, I'll give like 3 levels of like summarization basically.
Cool.
All right, guys. Have a good night. Enjoy yourselves.
All right.
Later.
Yeah.
Peace.
Later.
Bye.